The light is dying. You can see it in the way the shadows bleed across the snow, stretching long and purple across the slope, swallowing the pale ground beneath them. Up here, in the high mountain corridors of the Afghan highlands, the shift from afternoon to evening is not a slow, comfortable thing. It happens with a kind of finality. One moment, the white ridges are still catching a thin yellow glow from the low winter sun. The next, the temperature drops several degrees in what feels like minutes. The wind sharpens, and every living thing on that mountain knows that warmth has started its departure. And somewhere out on that slope, moving through knee-deep snow with a staff in one hand and a child close behind, a shepherd is bringing the herd home before the cold seals the mountain shut. This is not a story about poverty. It is not a story about hardship in the way that word is usually meant. What you are about to watch, and what we are going to understand together, is something that most modern people have never seen and could not replicate. It is a system, a living, moving, breathing system built across generations, held together not by technology or infrastructure, but by knowledge so precise and so deep that it would take a lifetime to fully absorb. The shepherd family bringing that herd home through the snow is not struggling in spite of their knowledge. They are moving with it, guided by it, protected by it. The question is whether we are able to see what they are actually doing. If you have ever wondered how people survive in some of the coldest and most remote places on Earth, not just for a season, but for centuries, across generations, in places where a single mistake can cost a life, then stay with this. Subscribe if you enjoy stories about real human intelligence, because what is waiting in this video goes far deeper than you might expect. The Afghan highlands in winter operate by rules that do not negotiate. The Hindu Kush Range, cutting through the northeastern and central regions of the country, reaches elevations above 4,000 meters in many of its passes and valleys. Settlements tucked into its lower corridors, between 2,000 and 3,000 meters, still face winters that last 5 to 6 months and bring snowfall that can reach well above a meter in depth. The wind does not blow in those mountains. It carves. It finds every gap in fabric, every unprotected strip of skin, every hollow in the terrain where warmth might try to hide, and it removes it. Average winter temperatures in the high valleys regularly fall to -15 or -20 degrees Celsius at night, and in some years push lower still. For a shepherd family managing a herd of 30, 40, or 50 animals, the hours between midday and dusk represent a window that closes fast and punishes any family that misreads it. But here is what tends to be misunderstood. The family is not simply reacting to the cold. They are not stumbling home at dusk and hoping for the best. The entire arc of their day, from the moment the eldest wakes before light to the moment the last animal is secured for the night, is a choreography. Every movement has a logic. Every decision carries the weight of a calculation made not just in that moment, but refined over decades of observation and loss and learning. To follow that family from midday through sunset is to watch a masterclass in environmental intelligence that has almost no parallel in modern life. The midday feeding ground is not chosen at random. Afghan shepherd families who move their flocks through winter terrain read the mountain the way a ship's navigator reads open water. They look for south-facing slopes, where the angle of even the weak winter sun has softened the top layer of snow. They look for the edges of rocky outcroppings where wind has scoured the ground clear, leaving dry grass and hardened herbs exposed underneath. They track the behavior of wild animals, particularly birds, whose movements reveal where the ground is most accessible. The flock does not wander. It is positioned. The shepherd knows exactly how far from home the animals can graze and still make it back before the temperature shift locks the trail. That distance is not guesswork. It is calculated from years of experience and from a specific understanding of how snow changes its behavior as the day turns cold. In the early afternoon, the surface of packed snow is at its most stable, compressed by the weight of animals and people moving across it during the warmer hours. The crust holds, but once the temperature begins to fall sharply in the late afternoon, that same crust becomes brittle and unpredictable. Animals punching through frozen crust into loose snow underneath can twist a leg, panic, or simply exhaust themselves fighting the resistance. A large animal in distress on a steep slope in failing light, far from shelter, is a crisis that can cascade. One animal panics, and the others follow. The shepherd knows this. The distance from grazing ground to home pen is not determined by what is comfortable. It is determined by what is survivable. Now, here is the part that changes how you see the whole picture. The shepherd is not the only one managing this movement. The return home through the snow is a family operation, and each member of the family, including children as young as 8 or 9, occupies a specific and non-negotiable role in the system. This is not casual division of labor. It is precision coordination developed to manage a moving mass of animals across difficult terrain in shrinking light. The eldest, typically the father or grandfather, leads from the front. His job is not to push, it is to read. He is scanning the trail ahead, looking for the patches of ice that form in shadow first, identifying where the snow has drifted too deep for the smaller animals to cross without struggling, and choosing the line that keeps the flock moving at a steady pace, without breaks in momentum. A herd that stops on a steep slope in deep snow is a herd that is already losing. The animals begin to spread, the weaker ones lag, and the window for getting everyone home narrows with every minute of hesitation. The leader of the column sets a pace that is calibrated not to the fastest animal, but to the slowest, because the slowest animal, left behind, means someone has to go back out into the dark. Behind the herd, the younger members of the family hold the rear. Their role is to catch the animals that begin to separate. Every flock has its characters, animals that are older, heavier, or simply prone to veering off the trail when they sense warmth or smell something in the distance. The children and younger adults at the back know these animals by name, by habit, by behavior. They know which goat will try to cut left at the boulder near the second bend. They know which sheep tends to slow on the uphill stretch and needs a firm vocal command before the hesitation becomes a stop. This knowledge is not written anywhere. It lives in the people. And if you are thinking that this is remarkable, you have not yet heard the part that most people never consider. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the system waiting ahead of this moment, the one that begins the moment the herd actually arrives at the shelter, is where the real engineering lives. The shelter itself is the foundation of the whole operation, and it is far older than the family currently using it. In many highland communities across Afghanistan, animal shelters are integrated directly into the base of the family home, or built as a lower attached room sharing 1 or 2 walls with the main living quarters. This is not a coincidence of construction. It is deliberate thermal engineering, and it works on the same principle that passive house designers in Europe spend millions trying to replicate. The body heat of a densely packed group of animals generates a significant and continuous thermal load. 40 sheep pressed together in a stone enclosure through a winter night produce enough warmth to raise the temperature of the adjacent living space by several degrees without any additional fuel. In a climate where fuel is scarce and winter lasts 5 months, those degrees are not a comfort. They are survival arithmetic. The walls of the shelter are thick, in many cases exceeding 1 meter of packed stone and mud mortar. The roof sits low, minimizing interior volume and reducing the amount of air that needs to be heated. The floor is earthen and layered with dry vegetation, straw, or dried animal matter that insulates from below, because the ground in those highlands freezes and draws heat downward through the night. Every architectural decision in that structure answers a specific thermal question. How do we slow the escape of heat? How do we keep the animals dry and still? How do we keep the entrance sealed without creating suffocation? Each answer was found not by an architect, but by a family, and the family before them, and the one before that. The ventilation question alone reveals the sophistication of the system. A sealed room full of animals produces carbon dioxide and moisture in quantities that, without some release, would create a hostile atmosphere by morning. But an open vent allows cold air to pour in and undercuts the entire thermal strategy. Highland families solved this through elevation. Small gaps or openings placed near the top of the wall Positioned on the side away from the prevailing wind, allow warm, moist air to escape naturally without creating a draft at animal level. The cold air that enters in replacement sinks and warms as it mixes with the heat from the animals before it reaches the floor. It sounds simple, stated plainly. But understanding that convection works in your favor only if the opening is placed at the right height, on the right wall, facing away from the dominant wind direction, required observation and experimentation that played out across generations. No one sat down and calculated it. They lived it until it worked. Getting the herd home before sunset was never only about the animals. It was about what the animals made possible. The evening ritual around livestock in Afghan Highland families is a series of overlapping tasks performed under time pressure that would feel familiar to anyone who has ever managed a complex logistical operation. The animals must be checked for injury before the light fails entirely. Not a casual glance, but a hands-on assessment, running fingers along legs, checking hooves for ice buildup, examining eyes and noses for signs of respiratory illness that cold air accelerates. An injured or sick animal identified at dusk can be separated and treated. The same animal discovered at midnight in the dark represents a far more serious problem. The milking, where relevant, happens in this window. In many Afghan Highland households, goats continue to produce milk through winter at reduced volume, and that milk, consumed fresh or processed into dried cheese or cultured into something resembling yogurt, represents a critical nutritional supplement during the months when fresh food is almost entirely unavailable. The milk pulled from a herd in the last light of the afternoon is not a small thing. It is a direct contribution to the caloric and nutritional budget of the family through a night of severe cold. Wasting it because the herd came home too late to milk, before the cold thickened the animal's willingness to stand still, is a loss with real consequences. And then there is the feeding. What the herd receives at the end of the day matters as much as what it grazed during the afternoon, perhaps more. In the coldest months, when the grazing ground is buried deep and the day's forage was minimal, families supplement with stored fodder. That fodder, typically hay cut and dried before winter, compressed dry plant matter, or in some areas, the stored and dried leaves of specific shrubs, was gathered during autumn and stacked under covers or inside dedicated storage alcoves. The quantity stored, divided by the number of animals and the expected length of winter, determines the survival of the herd. A family that cuts that calculation close runs the risk of losing animals in February or March, when winter fatigue sets in but the thaw is still weeks away. A family that calculates generously runs out of fodder in January and faces the same outcome from the other direction. This is the tension that sits underneath every calm-looking moment in a Highland shepherd family's winter. The math is always running. The margin is always thinner than it looks from the outside. What keeps that margin workable is a form of collective intelligence that operates continuously and rarely gets acknowledged. The women of the household, in traditional Afghan Highland settings, hold enormous logistical authority over the interior economy of the family. The management of stored food, the monitoring of fodder levels, the tracking of which animals are eating less and which are eating more, the preparation of feed supplements from dried plants and grains, the maintenance of the fire schedule that keeps the living space above a functional temperature through the night, these are not passive domestic tasks. They are the operational core of the survival system. While the shepherd reads the mountain, the household reads the stores and the animals and the fire, and the two streams of knowledge converge every evening when the herd comes home. The fire itself deserves a moment. Fuel in the Highland winter is rationed with a precision that would surprise most people who have never had to think about it. Wood, where available, is supplemented heavily with dried animal matter, collected and shaped into dense fuel blocks through autumn. These blocks burn slower and longer than wood, with a lower flame but a sustained heat output that suits the overnight warming requirements of the home better than a fast wood fire would. The fire is not left to burn freely. It is fed at specific intervals, calculated by the person tending it to match the heat requirements of the space against the remaining fuel supply. Going to sleep with the fire burning too high wastes fuel that may be needed in the deep cold of January. Going to sleep with the fire too low risks a drop in interior temperature that can harm sleeping children or elderly family members. These calculations, fuel rate against temperature, fodder against herd size, grazing distance against trail safety, are not written on paper. They are encoded in experience, in habit, in the instinctive reading of conditions that comes from living inside a system for long enough that it becomes part of how you think. The eldest member of the family carries the deepest version of this knowledge. The children are absorbing it, whether they realize it or not, every single afternoon when they follow the herd home through the snow. There is something that happens in the last 20 minutes before the herd reaches the shelter gate that is easy to miss if you do not know to look for it. The animals change their behavior. A flock that has been grazing or moving loosely across a hillside begins to compact as it approaches home. The spacing between animals tightens. The pace, which often slows on the steepest section of the return trail, accelerates again near the final approach. This is not trained behavior in the way that a dog's commands are trained. It is something older. The animals know the shelter. They know what the smell of it means in that temperature. They know that the cold is getting worse and the shelter is getting closer, and their bodies respond to that convergence with something that looks, from the outside, remarkably like relief. The shepherd at the front reads that behavioral change in real time. When the herd compacts naturally and the pace lifts, he knows the animals are oriented and moving with intention. His job in that final stretch is to hold the line, to prevent the surge that can happen when animals get close to home and begin to rush. A bottleneck at the shelter entrance, with 20 or 30 animals trying to pass through a narrow gap simultaneously, is dangerous in winter. Animals knock each other off footing. Smaller ones get crushed against the stone frame, and the chaos of the entry can injure the very animals the entire afternoon's effort was meant to protect. The shepherd uses voice, staff, and body position to meter the flow through the gate, one manageable group at a time, reading the pressure of the herd against his ability to regulate it. This is the moment where everything the day built to converges. The trail reading, the pace calibration, the role of each family member, the behavioral knowledge of individual animals, all of it lands in this 2-minute passage through the gate. And when it works, when the last animal clears the entrance and the door is pulled shut behind them, what you are witnessing is the successful completion of a system that has been refined over generations to deliver exactly that outcome. It looks like a family coming home from the fields. It is actually an act of total environmental mastery. In the modern world, we have a tendency to evaluate traditional knowledge systems by what they lack. We see no thermometers, no written plans, no veterinary clinics within reach, no emergency services if something goes wrong, and we read those absences as deficits. What we miss is what those absences produced. The knowledge that developed in the space where those tools do not exist is richer, more contextual, and in many ways more sophisticated than what gets replaced when the tools arrive. A shepherd who has spent 30 winters reading a specific mountain has a model of that mountain in his mind that no digital map or sensor system currently replicates. He knows where the ice forms first, where the snow is deepest, where the animals find hidden water under the frozen surface, where the wind drops enough to allow rest, and where it accelerates enough to be dangerous. That knowledge is not general. It is specific to that mountain, that herd, that family. And here is the reversal that the whole afternoon earns. When the herd is home, the shelter sealed, the fire adjusted, the children fed, and the family gathers in the warmth that the animals themselves helped create. What you are looking at is not a family that survived despite the mountain. It is a family that survived because they understood the mountain well enough to live inside its logic rather than against it. That is not a small thing. That is not a coincidence. That is knowledge earned over centuries, passed through hands and eyes and long cold afternoons, tested every single winter and refined every single time. The sunset over the Afghan highlands is extraordinary. The snow turns colors that seem impossible for snow, deep orange, then rose, then a brief and violent red before the blue takes everything. And somewhere on that slope, the trail that the herd just walked is already filling with wind-driven snow, the footprints disappearing, the path erasing itself behind them as if it was never there. By morning, no one would know which way they came. But the family already knows. They knew it before they left. They built that knowledge so deeply into themselves that the mountain erasing the evidence changes nothing. If this kind of hidden intelligence, the engineering that lives in people rather than in buildings, the knowledge that survives because it works rather than because it was written down, if that is the kind of story that pulls you in, then this channel is built for you. Leave a comment telling us which community, which traditional system, which forgotten way of life you want to understand next. Maybe it is the underground homes of another mountain people. Maybe it is a shepherd tradition from a completely different continent. Maybe it is something closer to where you are. Whatever it is, we will go there. Subscribe so you do not miss it, because the next one is already coming. And the margin, as always, is thinner than it looks.